Welcome to Lancefield on the Line. My name is David Lancefield. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Niko Canner, the founder of Incandescent, a modern age consultancy that helps large corporates on strategic and organizational issues as a thought leader. It also works with founders, helping them scale up their ventures, and also nonprofits and foundations on important systemic issues. Niko, you were a senior partner of Kassenbach and Partners, which was bought by Booz and Company. You're the author of a brilliant series of blogs that I've been enjoying most recently called On Human Enterprise. And you are a board member in a number of organizations. You chair the board of Screens with a K, a SaaS cloud-based visual engine that enables users to build personalized experiences. And you're also a board member of Block Renovation and Catchafire. Niko, you're coming in from New York City, and you are most welcome today.
Excited to be in conversation with you, David.
Fantastic. You occupy lots of different worlds. I'm jealous in a good way. And we are going to talk about systemic issues. We're going to talk about strategy, leadership, and all of your ideas around that. But as we come out of the pandemic, at least hoping we come out of the pandemic relatively soon, depending on which country you're in, it does still leave us with quite a few systemic issues. Some would say that the pandemic has actually accelerated some of them, particularly around income inequality, potentially climate change and more. You work with leaders of large organizations, and many of them will be under even more pressure than before to deliver results, right? Shareholder value right now. How do they do both though? Shareholder value and also make a contribution to these important systemic issues, given the rise of responsible capitalism. When you're under pressure, how do you actually do both?
So where I'd like to start, it's a profound question that could occupy hours of conversation between us. Where I'd like to start is a very simple idea, which relates to the specificity of thinking that's required to achieve anything extraordinary. So every company of consequence is thinking right now about ESG, what are the commitments they make, the bets they make, what is their role, and the directions that should take vary so much depending on what it is the company does. Are you a tier one automotive supplier or a regional bank? But the point that I think has the most generality is that achieving something in that space requires being extremely clear about what it would matter to do and to set a standard that then creates a kind of tension between where the company is and what it means to get there. You know, one of the distinctions that I always think about is between what I call the default path and the extraordinary path. The default path is what most of us are on most of the time, that we have a kind of vague or incomplete commitment to a goal. And so we experience very little cognitive dissonance between whatever it is that we're doing and what would be required to achieve the goal. And as a result, we tend to just keep doing what comes naturally. The extraordinary path is one in which the commitment to a goal becomes very sharp and vivid and tight, so that there's quite a lot of cognitive dissonance between where you are and what the goal requires. And as you internalize the painfulness of that gap, that's what causes you to do the things, to take risks, form different kinds of partnerships, unlearn the things that you need to unlearn in order to move forward. And I think every company of consequence needs to be on some version of that extraordinary path as it relates to ESG, however they define it.
That's a brilliant answer. If you've been a leader, let's just call it an individual rather than leader for the moment, an individual who's been on the default path for a while, potentially quite successfully, delivering the numbers, delivering results, moving up the career ladder, can you make the leap to become extraordinary or move to the extraordinary path? Or are you, and I simplify for a moment, are you, if you like, born to be extraordinary? How much can you nurture leaders and just to make that shift from default to, or more default
I
to
see it
extraordinary?
as a discipline and not an attribute. So
Yes.
to tell a particular story of a person that I admire. One of the participants in the first class of Acumen's Global Fellows program, a program that I'd worked with Jacqueline Novogratz at Acumen to develop, was a woman named Katie Hill. And after Katie went to Stanford Business School, she joined Apple. And she was in a kind of mid-level role in this giant company with a significant focus on questions of sustainability. And that was a moment where Apple had certainly formed a kind of mindset that they cared significantly about climate as an issue, but they had not staked out any kind of a leading profile on the question.
Right.
And they weren't at that moment as bold and specific about their aspirations on climate as they later became. And a few leaders, of whom Katie, relatively early in her career and relatively far down in this vast organization, was one, they began to formulate what would it mean for Apple's boldness and imagination in that space of climate to be the moral equivalent of what Apple had done for consumers to win the relevance that had defined them as a company. And gradually, through a kind of crystalline thought process of what would that be, and through building a larger and larger coalition, they enlisted the company in a commitment to get to carbon neutrality. And that in turn sort of unearthed all kinds of problems and gaps. There are a lot of things in an enterprise of that magnitude that didn't have solutions, that required solutions in order to achieve a target like that.
It's one thing to make the commitment, it's the other thing to actually deliver it in an integrated, cohesive way across the org. You find all these problems, as you say.
And it was holding that tension that then drove innovation and enabled Apple then subsequently to take on an even larger goal, which remains a work in progress, about how could we move toward carbon neutrality across our vast supply chain. So here are a few people, not at the very top of a company, who begin a process of conversation that leads to a commitment that's of vast import for the world.
That's quite something. So if it is a discipline as opposed to a characteristic or a trait per se, what in that case, what did they actually do? What skills, disciplines do they apply in order to, if you like, start small and really make clearly what is not only work in progress, but clearly making an impact already on a vast scale?
So since much of the conversation, David, that you and I have been having in different forums is about strategy, let me sort of bring out a particular aspect of how this relates to strategy. And I think often people have the misconception that strategy is solely a matter of how whole companies compete. And of course, that's a part of it. But if you sort of bore down a little bit further and you just ask the very basic question, what does strategic clarity mean? What does it consist of? The fundamental elements, as I see it, are that strategic clarity is about commitment to a destination and a core set of mutually reinforcing concepts that shape a multitude of choices for how to get there. Like the essence of strategy combines a few ideas that connect the why of what we're committed to how that is always incredibly complex in its details. And so I think if we could watch the movie of what Katie and her colleagues were doing at Apple, they were moving back and forth between those three basic elements of commitments, concepts, and choices.
Yes.
And they were making the commitment feel tangible, meaningful, and possible by connecting not just what would this do for the world and for Apple's standing in the world, but what would be required of Apple in order to go on this journey?
Yes.
And how would the work of getting there make Apple a better company in many ways, much as, for instance, Alcoa, when they set the target around workplace safety, that was both important in itself, but a vehicle for developing the practices, the disciplines, the metrics that would make Alcoa higher quality, lower cost manufacturer. When you walk through the door of an ambitious goal in ESG done well, that can almost always be an instrument for the company to refine its own capabilities in ways that have a vast web of relevance to the rest of how it operates.
Yes. I mean, what you say there clearly gives a great example of Katie and her colleagues being very talented in terms of both being able to do the three elements you described, connecting them, getting into the detail when they need to, keeping the big picture front of mind. And that's a tall order. And you've written eloquently about how you develop, if you like, strategists and how people learn to become strategists, as opposed to it just being the single person or the core team at the top of the organization. What do organizations need to do to develop better strategists in terms of, as a group of people? What can they practically do to make sure that the examples you've given, that great example of Apple, is not just a sort of a one-off, but actually it's an ongoing capability that can be used for different causes?
So one very basic observation is no one learns to be a good strategist without working on strategy.
Yes.
So
great point.
The very first thing that a company needs to do in order to systematically develop a wide enough bench of strategists, not just people in a strategy department, but people in a wide range of roles, to be able to handle the complexity of all the questions coming at them. The example of Apple being of a question that might not in a traditional way present as a strategy question, but required strategic thinking and strategic commitment. So a company needs to have a discipline for identifying and establishing briefs for a range of questions that require strategic thinking. Second, they need to identify people who have an aptitude and drive to learn to be strategists. And that aptitude centers on a kind of skill and embrace of using ideas to move the needle on actions. Even
Yes.
some relatively senior executives are quite resistant to the idea that it is practical to think conceptually about a problem, arrive at an answer, and then use that answer for many, many people to take
Yes.
action in an integrated way. And we all know many such executives. There are others who kind of immediately see the value of conceptual thinking that is connected to action and teach those people about how to be better strategists, because the uptake will be 2 to 3 orders of magnitude higher.
Yes.
And then, like many things, strategic thinking is learned through kind of apprenticeship and comparative learning from peers as well as teachers, where you're working on a question that demands strategic thinking. And you're able to sort of compare and contrast what you're doing to what others are doing. It
Yes.
isn't simply a matter of ingesting models. Here is how Clay Christensen thought about disruptive innovation, helpful as Clay's ideas are. But more like, okay, I'm trying to simplify this very complex problem so I can get my arms around it. Here's what I'm trying to do. How is that similar or different from what other people whose problems might not be superficially related, but require the same simplifying and clarifying? How is what I'm doing similar or different to what they're doing? And how can I begin to synthesize the learnings from their experience as well as my own? So it's that kind of 3-part process of the problem, the person, and the learning context that together come together to make it more than just a game of chance.
Oh, that's a great answer. I think my own experience and observation, particularly at the moment, is there is a greater need for people who can do what you described, given the challenges and indeed opportunities facing many organizations. But throughout what you described there, Niko, and in the Apple example, the importance of conversation is critical. And you've talked about the power of good conversation beyond the performance theatre that we often see and hear and experience. So it's a superficial conversation, sounds really good, and then you reflect back and think nothing was actually said. It was just, the peacock feathers go up, as it were. People sort of strut around, use lots of terms, but doesn't mean very much. Having proper, intelligent, thoughtful conversations. And I have your quote. You say, great strategic conversations both stretch and support, nourish and confront. So different elements, axes of that. Just tell me a little bit more about what you meant by that statement and how people can do it in practice.
So let me begin with a kind of personal observation, and I'd be curious if this is an experience that you share. To me, just a basic, fundamental, irreducible fact about doing strategy is that we are all inadequate to do it well when we start out on the process. On a very personal level, that means I experience over and over again my own inadequate view of being able to see what a workable answer would be at the outset of the journey, and maybe even most so when I have a clear intuition about what that answer might be, because anybody who's done this more than a few times has been wrong enough to learn to be suspicious of intuitions, even when they're clear and feel powerful. So I'm curious whether that's an experience you share.
I do, absolutely. I have moments recently where I'm not short of a framework or a tool or an experience, but at the beginning you think, where do I start? Because your head is brimming with ideas, stimuli, and so forth. And actually have a bit of a test. It's a bit like writing articles, which is a different topic of conversation. If it sort of feels too easy, or as either a process or you have this hypothesis that sort of, or an answer, and there is no grit, what I call grit in the system. It just sort of flows really easily. Either it is something amazing. I can't think many of those, or we've gone down the wrong alleyway and we've been a bit lazy. But that I think you have to feel comfortable with feeling uncomfortable at different points in the process, particularly the beginning, and especially senior people, experienced people, who often you have to feel sort of get over themselves, right? And actually be able and willing to take questions, answer them, actually say, I don't know, let's explore.
One of my best teachers was a poetry teacher, the late Lucy Brock-Bordeaux. And for years, both in school and then later in life, I'd do workshops with her and other writers. And Lucy would often say, go in fear of. And I hear you saying, kind of go in fear of easy answers. Go in fear of the notion that things could be as simple as they sometimes appear at first. And part of what a good conversation about strategy does is it enables people whose view of the situation and what to do about it are each inadequate to be with one another long enough and well enough to assemble an insight that none of them at the beginning fully has. And part of what that involves is a kind of psychological safety to be vulnerable, to acknowledge one's unknowns and uncertainties. But for all of the emphasis on psychological safety, which I think is valuable, part of what's hard about a conversation about about strategy is that psychological safety needs to be mixed with its opposite, with a real internalization of the way in which we all in the room and the institution that we steward is in fact unsafe. Like that's our reality. There's this, since I started this riff by talking about Lucy, I'll close it with some lines from a poem. W.H. Auden wrote this lovely poem called Leap Before You Look. And the poem ends, a solitude 10,000 fathoms deep sustains the bed on which we lie, my dear. Although I love you, you will have to leap. Our dream of safety has to disappear. I think one of the most powerful things that I see happen in the best strategy processes is a dream of safety disappears and something better, something realer takes its place.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I guess it's creating the conditions, as you say, where you can take a leap of faith, if you like, look into yourself and for the rebellious streak, search for creativity, even if it, and I think viscerally, it actually feels genuinely uncomfortable. This is not just a sort of hypothetical thing. I think physically, actually, you'll feel uncomfortable at certain moments, but you're doing it with people who are not the same as you, but they at least share a construct, which is, hey, let's try this together. So there is, I would say there's a degree of safety without it being complacency. So safety with sort of, okay, let's try this, but actually that doesn't mean we know what the next step is. So it's not just a linear process.
Right. Part of why I mean, you talked at the beginning of this conversation about the different things that my colleagues and I at Incandescent do. And it might seem crazy that an organization full of strategists that is so small, I mean, I think we're like 12 people today, we'll be 14 in a few weeks. But why, if the essence of strategy is generally about focus, why would so few people do such a diverse group of things? You'd think that having such a crazy idea would disqualify us from being strategists at all. And
I'm sure there's coherence though, Niko. I'm sure there's coherence.
Is each of those different kinds of endeavors, the entrepreneurship, the work with larger enterprises, the more complex work on systems change, each of those brings out in a sharper way something that is relevant to the others. And as you and I were talking about sort of the leadership team, whether it's the leadership team of an enterprise or the leadership team at some other level, doing strategy, and that dance between safety and an appreciation of danger that good strategy requires. And that can sometimes be hard to see in a larger company. It is not hard to see, and it is not hard to experience when you're a founder.
Yes.
When you're a founder, it is immediate and visceral and real, like just how big the gap is between aspiration and reality. We have a picture that we love to talk about at Incandescent that I first saw as a kind of pencil illustration in a book called Philosophical Investigations. And there's a little drawing that you could see alternately as a duck or a rabbit, depending on which way you're inclined. And you go back and forth, duck, rabbit, but you can never see it both at exactly the same time. And we like to think about entrepreneurial endeavor, wherever it might live, whether literally in a founding team or in that kind of a mindset as it might exist in a larger institution, as this dance between seeing the world and the opportunity as an inevitability and something that must and will be, which we think of as the duck way of seeing the world, and then seeing the many gaps and inconsistencies and unsolved problems and unknowns and quandaries that stand between wherever you are and that goal, which we see as the rabbit view of the world. There's no achieving anything of importance without having some blend of the duck and the rabbit. A strategist needs both that kind of duck vision of what could be, even if we don't know quite how to get there, combined with the skeptical, pragmatic rabbit of like, okay, and now if we choose that, what are the 15 important things that are wrong, missing, we don't know, we do the opposite. And it's that combination that gives strategy efficacy.
I really like that. I can see you and your team getting that, getting the duck and the rabbit and the benefit. How do you convince, demonstrate, show to your clients who perhaps have been one of the two, or spent their worlds in one of the two? Is it through experience? Is it by immersing people in different worlds? How do you, given the blend of the three worlds, if you like, this is, I'm sure there's more than three, the systems work that you do, the venture work for founders, the corporate work. I can see it, and you and I can see the benefits, but I'm not sure every client would see the benefits of those different lenses and perspectives. How do you show it? How do you convince them of it?
that's why conversation is so important.
Yeah.
It's inevitably these different perspectives live on their own teams.
Mm.
And there was a piece of strategy work that we did for a nonprofit, which had a very powerful, well-connected board. And at the very outset of this effort, the founder, who was nearing the end of the second decade of building this organization and thinking about how do we achieve the next level of impact on a very complex, thorny problem,
Right.
asked us to go around and talk to each of the board members and get their perspectives as part of sort of framing what this work even needed to be.
Yes.
And we talked to one board member who was seeing the question very much like a business strategy. Like there are certain things we programmatically do. There are markets for those things. How do we do more of that? How do we create more value for the various stakeholders
Yes.
who are the sponsors of these programs? And then there was another board member who described the way in which today's impact was like sort of a pond in the ocean of the ultimate problem the organization was trying to solve, and asked a question of, well, what would it mean to be the catalyst of a fundamentally greater change? Like how could such a thing occur with no assumption that that necessarily even related to the programs the organization did today? So we had this one slide that had a quote from one board member at one end of it and a quote from the other board member at the other. And we spent a lot of conversation, both in that first meeting and over the course of several months of work, coming back to that slide, staring at it and saying, it probably wasn't a choice between these two perspectives. It's probably a question of how could the strategy honor each of these two ideas? What was the place of each in the strategy? And then who in the organization could live each of these two perspectives? Because the skills, the patterns of working, the kinds of external partnerships to live in the first way and live in the second way were pretty significantly different. And yet the organization needed to learn to be a home to both.
That's really powerful. You know what I really like about this whole conversation and our previous conversations with you and I have got to know each other is you really focus on the quality of the thinking and the quality of the conversation as being central to any exercise. We focus today on strategy, but it covers other aspects of organizations. Yes, you need analysis. Yes, you need a process. They're both important. But actually what you've been talking about throughout is getting people to think, express, debate, disagree, be unsafe at times. And I guess to break through to that, to move away from the default path, at least to be on a path, but to aim for the extraordinary. And I think that's very powerful, and I think that's very distinctive. And I have to say, I absolutely love it.
Thank you. We were talking earlier about going in fear of, and one thing to go in fear of is the means obscuring the ends. When people learn to be strategists, as both you and I have spent large parts of our lives trying to learn to do, like the means are very absorbing, and they require a great deal of analysis and a great deal of craft. And clients can become enamored of those means. You have a way of doing kind of analysis and creating this kind of deliverable, like that's interesting. I want that. But those are only means. And I think whether one is the leader of a large enterprise or an advisor from the outside, or founder trying to craft a path to something that is initially far, far beyond her grasp. It is so important to stay in touch with what is the end, what are the gaps, how do I wrestle with those gaps for real? And then all of the tools of method become simply things to use, combine, adapt in the service of that wrestling. I think when people
That's a great way to put it.
fully learn that, they've learned to become strategists for real.
That's brilliant. You are brilliant. I love our conversations. Niko, that was stimulating, enriching. My brain is ticking over. I mean, I'm going in lots of directions at the moment, which is fantastic. I love the fact you call out the human aspect of the process, the deeply human aspect. And the fact that you and I, although we're experienced, we've had some successes, no doubt we've had some failures as well. We're still learning and unlearning and trying to tackle some of the biggest systemic changes, as well as, putting food on the table. You have to do both. Niko, where can people find out more about you and your endeavors if they're interested in terms of a site, a website, your blog? Tell us a bit about that as we draw to a close.
There's a site, incandescent.com, that sort of tells the story of our firm, who we are, what we do. But I think far more interesting is On Human Enterprise, the blog that I've been building over the past 8 years, which is a kind of meditation on these questions as they relate to organizations and individuals, a mixture of concept, method, sort of reflections on practical situations, sort of 3 parts Montaigne, 1 part McKinsey. And I think people who enjoyed this conversation would probably find much to think about by flipping through the 120 or so essays on different topics that have emerged from the past 8 years of thinking and experience.
That is a proper body of work. I've just started, and as I said to you in an email before, I shed a tear of emotion reading one of the articles. I thought it was brilliant, brilliantly expressed, philosophical, deep, and also very practical. And that's a rare combination. You are a rare combination. I think you're a brilliant man. Niko, thank you for your time today.
Thanks so much.
That was another edition of Lancefield on the Line.